The sky was burning. Flames danced in the sky like angry spirits as Jason's escape pod tore through the clouds, trailing smoke behind it. Alarms screamed in his ears, red lights flashed across the control panel, and everything shook so violently that he could barely keep his eyes open. He had no control left. The pod was going down, and fast. Jason gritted his teeth. His fingers were bleeding from trying to fix the broken controls, but it was too late. The ship had already been hit by a strange energy blast, and whatever this planet was, it didn't want visitors. He crashed hard. The impact knocked the breath out of his lungs. For a moment, everything was silent. Then came pain, sharp, deep, everywhere. Jason opened his eyes slowly. Smoke filled the cracked glass of the pod window. Trees with glowing blue leaves stood tall around him, and the ground was covered in soft moss that sparkled faintly in the darkness. It was like a dream, or a nightmare. He pushed open the hatch and crawled out, coughing and bleeding. His right leg felt broken, and his head throbbed with every heartbeat. But he was alive. That was something. The forest around him was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the faint hum of energy in the air, like the forest itself was watching. Jason tried to stand, using a broken tree branch as a crutch. He had to move. The ship's tracking system might have sent a distress signal before the crash, but he couldn't count on that. This wasn't Earth. This wasn't even human territory. This was deep space, uncharted and full of unknown dangers. He limped forward, one step at a time, deeper into the forest. Time passed. Minutes. Hours. He didn't know. The sky above was dark, painted with stars he didn't recognize. His vision blurred. His breath grew short. Just as his legs gave out and he fell to his knees, he heard it. A sound. A cry. Not human. Jason looked up. Through the trees, just beyond a strange glowing bush, he saw her. She was crouched on the ground, her arms covering her head, trembling. Her skin was silver blue, and her eyes glowed with a soft violet light. She looked young, maybe his age, maybe older. Hard to tell with aliens. And then he saw what she was hiding from. Figures moved through the shadows, tall, thin, and cloaked in something like armor made of bone and metal. They had long arms and bows that crackled with energy. One of them raised a weapon, took aim at the girl, and drew back its arrow. Jason didn't think. His body moved before his mind could stop it. He screamed and threw himself between her and the arrow. The impact hit like lightning. The arrow didn't just pierce flesh. It burned with something cold and alive. It slammed into Jason's back, and he collapsed with a gasp. Pain flooded his body. He couldn't breathe. The girl looked up, shocked, as his body hit the ground in front of her. Their eyes met for the first time. Jason expected fear, disgust. But instead, her glowing eyes widened with something else, something like wonder. She reached toward him slowly, her hand trembling, and whispered something in her language, words he didn't understand. Then everything went dark. He expected death, but instead, he dreamed. He saw stars falling from the sky, a world covered in fire, and a figure, himself, standing between two armies. The sky cracked open, and a voice called his name. When he woke again, he wasn't in the forest. He was inside a cave, warm and glowing, lit by crystals growing from the walls. The pain was gone. The arrow wound, gone. His body felt whole. Jason blinked. The girl was sitting beside him, watching him closely. She looked tired but calm. "You saved me," she said softly, in broken English. Jason stared at her. "You speak English?" She nodded slowly. "A little. Learned, long time ago. But you are not what we thought." "What do you mean?" he asked. She leaned closer. Her voice shook slightly. "They said humans were destroyers. But you shielded me. You bled for me." Jason didn't understand. not fully, but he could feel something strange in the air around him. Something deep, powerful, watching. "Why did you help me?" she asked. He looked into her eyes. "Because you were in danger, and I couldn't just watch." The girl stared at him for a long moment. Then she said something that made his blood run cold. "You are the one the prophecy spoke of," she whispered. "The one who would change everything." Jason sat up slowly, confused. What prophecy? But she didn't answer. She only placed her hand over his heart. Her skin was cold and soft, and as her fingers touched him, a strange warmth filled his chest. "You are not just human anymore," she said. "You are chosen." Jason's breath caught in his throat. Outside, the wind howled, and deep in the shadows of the forest, something else stirred. Something dark, something angry. They had seen the light, and they were coming. Jason sat in the silence of the glowing cave, his heart still racing from everything he had seen, everything he had felt. The pain in his body was gone, but his thoughts were a storm. He kept replaying the moment in his mind. The arrows, the way he'd thrown himself in front of the girl, the way her eyes glowed right before everything went black. He turned slowly toward her. She sat a few feet away, cross-legged on the smooth stone floor. The crystals above cast soft light across her silver-blue skin. Her long, dark hair shimmered faintly, almost like it was absorbing the light and holding it. She looked young, no older than he was, maybe even younger, but there was something in her eyes that felt old, like she carried centuries inside her. "I don't even know your name," Jason said quietly. She tilted her head, then answered softly, "Serena." He repeated it under his breath. "Serena." It felt strange in his mouth, but right somehow. "I'm Jason," he added, as if it mattered. As if names meant anything here. Serena nodded, her expression unreadable. Then she turned her gaze away and stared into the glowing wall of the cave. Jason followed her eyes and noticed something he hadn't before, a marking etched into the stone. It looked like a spiral, but inside the spiral was the shape of a hand, a human hand, smaller than his, but unmistakably human. He slowly pushed himself up to stand, testing his balance. His leg, which had felt shattered before, now moved without pain. He walked over to the wall, studying the marking. "What is this?" he asked. Serena stood and joined him. Her voice was calm, but there was a deep weight behind it. "Old story. Before time. When skyfires first came." Jason frowned. "Skyfires." She nodded. "Long ago, beings came from stars. Not like us. Not like you. But both. They helped build our world. Then they left. But left a message. Said one day, one would return." Jason turned to her slowly. "And you think that's me?" She didn't speak for a moment. Then she raised her hand and placed it against the stone marking. The spiral began to glow faintly under her touch, but then flickered and faded. She lowered her hand and gestured to him. Jason hesitated. This was insane. He wasn't special. He was just a soldier who had crashed on the wrong planet. Nothing more. But something inside him pushed forward. He pressed his hand to the symbol. It lit up instantly. Not faint, but bright. Blindingly bright. The spiral spun slowly under his palm, and the stone warmed beneath his skin. Jason gasped. Images flashed in his mind. Visions of cities made of crystal, people with wings, ships that flew without engines, and a deep humming voice that whispered, "He has returned." Serena stepped back in awe, her eyes wide. "You awakened it." Jason pulled his hand away, breathing hard. What did I just see?" Serena's voice shook. "The truth. You saw the first memory." Jason turned toward her, heart thudding. "But I'm not from here. I'm not some chosen one. I'm just human." She looked at him quietly. Maybe that's why. Before he could ask what she meant, a deep rumble echoed through the cave. The crystals flickered, and the air turned cold. Jason reached for a rock out of instinct, gripping it like a weapon. Serena moved closer to him. From the tunnel behind them came footsteps, soft at first, then louder. Shadows moved along the walls. Jason braced himself, but Serena held out her hand to stop him. "It's okay," she said. "They are my people." Out of the shadows stepped three more beings like Serena, Velari, she had called them. They were tall, elegant, with glowing tattoos along their arms and faces. Their eyes immediately locked onto Jason. One of them, an older male with a long robe made of silver threads, stepped forward. His face was stern, lined with age and knowledge. "This is him?" he asked Serena. She nodded. "He shielded me, took the arrow. The forest chose him." The elder stared at Jason. "You touched the memory." Jason nodded slowly. "Yeah, I didn't mean to. It just happened." The elder's eyes narrowed, but not in anger, more like disbelief. "You may not know it yet," the elder said, "but you have changed the path of our world." Jason blinked. "All I did was save someone from getting shot." Serena stepped in. That was enough. The elder turned to her. "He must come to the heart of the forest. If the prophecy is true, it will accept him. If not." Jason didn't like the way that sentence ended. He looked at Serena. "Do I have a choice?" She gave him a soft smile. "You always have a choice, but some paths choose us." Jason let out a long breath and nodded. "Then let's go." The journey through the forest was different this time. Jason could feel it. The trees seemed to move aside for them. The wind whispered through the leaves like it knew his name. Strange glowing creatures watched from the shadows, but didn't attack. As they walked, Serena explained bits and pieces. The Velari had once ruled this planet in peace, guided by nature and energy. But then came the warlord, an invader from the stars who brought machines and poison. He wanted the forest's power for himself. Many Velari died. The rest hid, waiting for the prophecy to come true. Jason listened, trying to understand. He still didn't believe he was some chosen hero, but something inside him, something deep, was beginning to stir. They reached a clearing. In the center stood a tree larger than anything Jason had ever seen. Its roots twisted through the earth like rivers, and its leaves shimmered gold and green. "The heart," Serena whispered. Jason stepped forward. The moment his foot touched the soft grass of the clearing, the tree began to glow. The light was warm, alive. Jason felt it rush through him. Memories not his own, languages he didn't know, emotions too big for one person to hold. He dropped to his knees. From somewhere deep within the tree, a voice spoke, not aloud, but in his mind. "You carry the fire. You carry the pain. You carry the choice." Jason gasped. His body trembled. He could barely breathe. Then the voice faded. Serena ran to him, catching him before he fell. "You heard it?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "It spoke to me." The elder behind them stepped forward. "Then it is true. He is the one." Jason looked up, his voice barely a whisper. "What happens now?" The elder's face was grave. "Now, we prepare for war." And in the distance, beyond the safety of the glowing forest, the sky cracked with thunder. Ships, cold, black, and buzzing with dark energy, entered the atmosphere. The warlord had found them. And Jason was out of time. The forest no longer whispered Jason's name. Now it screamed warnings with every rustling leaf, every trembling branch. The air was tight with tension, electric and heavy. Even the glowing plants that once lit the way now dimmed, like they were afraid. Something terrible had entered this world, and it was hunting them. Jason stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the sky. He watched as sleek black ships pierced the clouds like knives. Their engines gave off a low hum, one that vibrated through the ground and into his bones. These were not simple patrol crafts. They were war machines, symbols of conquest. Beside him, Serena's eyes shimmered with fear. She didn't speak, but her hands were clenched tightly into fists. The other Velari around them moved with urgency now, their peaceful rhythm broken. Children were being ushered into hiding places beneath roots. Elders whispered strange words to the trees. Warriors, few in number, checked their ancient weapons, though they all knew their blades and staffs were no match for what was coming. Jason turned to the elder, his voice low and steady. "How long before they reach us?" The elder didn't answer right away. His face was pale, eyes fixed on the distant sky. Then he said, "Not long. They know the heart revealed itself. The warlord has waited for this." Jason blinked. Waited for what? The elder's gaze moved to him. "For you." Those words hit like stone. Jason looked at Serena, confused and angry. "I thought you said he didn't know about me." "He didn't," she said quietly. "But now he does." When the tree spoke, the energy ripple traveled far. He felt it. Jason exhaled sharply. "So now what? You said I awakened something. But I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't have powers. I'm not magic. I'm just." "You shielded her," the elder interrupted. "That was the first sign." Jason opened his mouth to argue, but stopped. Because deep down, something had changed. He could feel it. His wounds had healed too fast. His body moved lighter than before. The tree had spoken to him in a voice older than time. Maybe he wasn't just human anymore. Maybe he had been marked. Still, doubt gnawed at him. A loud, shrill noise shattered the silence. Jason ducked instinctively, and above the forest, a series of small drones zipped through the trees, scanning everything with red beams. They hovered for a moment, then shot away. "They've found the outer edge of the village," Serena said. "They'll send in the hunters next." Jason turned to her, something sharp and urgent rising in his chest. "We need to move. We can't stay here." But the elder shook his head. "The heart cannot be moved. If they destroy it, we lose everything. You are the only one who can protect it now." Jason stared at him, stunned. "Me? How? With what?" Before the elder could answer, a soft hand touched Jason's shoulder. Serena stood close now, her voice barely a whisper. "There is something else. Something I didn't tell you." Jason turned toward her slowly. "The warlord," she said, "has human blood." Jason stiffened. "What?" "He was one of the early visitors, long ago. But he was twisted by dark energy. The forest rejected him, and he swore to destroy it." Jason felt the air leave his lungs. "He's from Earth." Serena nodded. "Partly. His name was Cassian Ward. A scientist. Explorer, but he became something else. Something cruel. Now he believes this planet belongs to him." Jason clenched his fists. "Then let's make sure he never gets it." But just as he spoke those words, an explosion shook the ground. A pillar of smoke rose into the sky beyond the trees. The first attack had begun. War cries echoed through the forest, deep, mechanical, inhuman. The hunters were coming. Velari warriors rushed into formation. Spears made of crystal, bows strung with vines that glowed softly, were raised high. It all looked beautiful and hopeless. Jason scanned the area. His training kicked in. He had been a soldier once, even if he hadn't wanted to be. He saw weak points, cover, choke points. But it wouldn't be enough. Not against drones and war machines. "We need higher ground," he said. "We can't fight them here. They'll pick us off." Serena looked at him. "There's an old watchtower, east side of the village. It hasn't been used in years." "Then that's where we go," Jason said. "I need to see what we're up against." They moved quickly. Jason ran beside Serena, his eyes scanning every tree, every shadow. Distant blasts shook the forest. The smell of burning wood began to drift through the air. They reached the tower, a tall structure woven into a living tree, with stairs spiraling upward. Jason climbed fast, boots thudding against the wood. At the top, he looked through the open canopy, and what he saw turned his blood to ice. Dozens of hunter units, tall, skeletal machines with glowing red eyes, moved through the trees. Behind them came hover tanks, their cannons charged with sickly green energy. Above it all floated the warlord's command ship, shaped like a dark blade slicing through the sky. Jason stared, breathless. "They're not just here for the tree," he said. "They're here to wipe you out." Serena's voice came from behind. "And to take you." Jason turned. Her face was pale. "You don't understand," she said. "They want your blood, your connection to the tree. They want to twist it, like they twisted him." Jason felt rage boiling in his chest. "They won't." A crackling sound broke through the air. A voice. Cold, metallic, and human. "Jason Carter." The voice echoed from speakers on the ship. "You have something that belongs to me." Serena's eyes widened. "He knows your name." Jason's hands trembled. The voice continued. "Surrender now, and I will spare these creatures. Resist, and I will burn your forest to ash." Jason stared into the sky, and for the first time, he felt no fear, only fury. He looked at Serena, then at the forest below. "If he wants me," Jason said, "he's going to have to come down and take me." And far above, in the shadows of the ship, Cashin Ward, the warlord, smiled. His prize had just made his first mistake. He'd chosen to fight. The game had begun. Jason could feel the heat in his blood as he descended the watchtower. Every step pounded like thunder in his chest. His body moved faster now, sharper, like something ancient inside him had been awakened. He no longer felt like a lost soldier or a broken man who had crash-landed on a forgotten world. No, now he felt like a blade being drawn from fire. Behind him, Serena followed in silence. The fear in her eyes had changed. No longer the fear of death, but of loss, of what Jason might become, of what might be taken from them if they failed. Below, the Villari villagers were scattering, guided by Serena's kin. Mothers cradled their children, rushing into tunnels beneath the forest floor. Warriors lined up in desperation, ready to face machines with nothing but crystal blades and glowing staffs. There was no panic, only quiet bravery. They had lived with the shadow of the warlord for too long. Now they stood on the edge of extinction. Jason reached the ground and was met by the elder, who held a long staff carved from the roots of the heart tree. It pulsed faintly in his hands, as if alive. "You cannot fight him with muscle alone," the elder said. "He is not just man. He is machine, and darkness, and fury." Jason nodded. "Then I'll use something he doesn't have." The elder studied him carefully. "And what is that?" Jason looked at Serena, then back at the elder. "A reason to protect. He fights to conquer. I fight to save." The elder paused, then handed him the staff. "This belonged to the first guardian. It has not been held in 1,000 years. The forest remembers. We shall see if it remembers you." Jason gripped the staff. It felt warm, familiar, as if it had been waiting. Without another word, Jason moved through the village, guiding the Villari to defensive positions, placing traps where the hunters would march, setting plans into motion like pieces on a board. Though they had never trained together, the Villari responded to his voice. He spoke like someone who had led before, like someone who had something to lose. The sky darkened further, and then they came. The first wave of hunters moved through the forest, limbs clicking, sensors glowing red. Their movements were precise, cruel, calculating. Arrows of pure energy fired into the trees, setting them ablaze. One of the warriors screamed as he was thrown backward by a blast, his weapon shattered into pieces. Jason rushed toward the line of battle, staff in hand. The first hunter turned its glowing eyes toward him and fired. But Jason moved like wind. He spun the staff and deflected the bolt, the energy dispersing with a crackling flash. The hunter aimed again, but this time Jason charged. The staff struck metal with a sound like a bell. Sparks exploded. The hunter staggered back. Jason flipped the weapon, driving it upward into the machine's chest. A pulse of light erupted from the wood, and the hunter fell, lifeless. The Velari warriors around him gasped. For a moment, even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Jason turned. "We fight here. We fight now." The battle exploded into motion. Velari warriors leaped from tree to tree, firing arrows of light. Hunters responded with brutal precision. Explosions lit the sky. Trees burned. Roots cracked open. Jason moved through it all like a storm, striking, defending, pushing back wave after wave. Each time he fell, the staff pulled him up again, as if something inside it fueled his will. But the enemy was endless. For every hunter they destroyed, 2 more arrived. Behind them rolled the tanks, hovering machines that fired beams of green fire, disintegrating stone and soil alike. Then, through the chaos, Jason heard the scream. "Serena." He turned just in time to see her thrown to the ground, cornered by 2 hunters. Her bow had shattered. Her arm bled. One of the hunters raised its blade, ready to strike. Jason ran. He didn't think. He just moved. The forest itself seemed to pull him forward. Roots rose to catch his feet. Vines bent to open the way. He arrived in a blur, just as the blade came down. Jason threw himself forward and caught the strike with the staff. The force of the blow sent shockwaves through his body. His knees buckled, but he held firm. He twisted the weapon, broke the blade, and slammed the end of the staff into the hunter's chest. A burst of light threw it backward. The second hunter lunged, but Jason ducked, rolled, and struck again, this time driving the staff through the creature's center. Silence fell around them. Serena lay on the ground, stunned, her eyes wide with shock and something deeper. Jason knelt beside her and pulled her up gently. Her fingers curled into his shirt, and she whispered, "Why do you keep doing this?" Jason didn't answer at first. Then he said, softly, "Because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't." Behind them, the sounds of battle still roared, but now the Velari were pushing forward. Inspired, angry, united. But just when hope began to rise, the ground trembled. From the center of the forest, a new sound emerged, a sound no one had heard in centuries. The warlord had arrived. The trees bent unnaturally as the command ship descended, slow and deliberate. Its hull cracked open, revealing a platform of black stone and fire. And on that platform stood a figure, tall, armored in metal and shadows, eyes glowing like burning coals. Jason stared in horror. Cassian Ward, the man who had once been human, now something else entirely. His voice echoed across the battlefield. "Jason Carter, you surprise me. I thought humanity had grown soft." Jason stepped forward, staff in hand, breath steady. "I'm not here for your opinion." Cassian's lips curled into a smile. "No, you're here because you think you matter, because the forest whispered your name. But let me show you what whispers mean, in the fire." He raised his arm. A wave of pure energy burst forth, burning through trees, tearing the land. Jason raised the staff, and the blast hit him full force. He was thrown backward, crashing through roots and stone. The world spun. Darkness closed in. But even as his vision blurred, he saw Serena running toward him. He tried to move, to rise, and then, just before the world went black, he saw Cassian stepping from the ship, walking toward the heart tree with fire in his hands. Jason's last thought before he slipped into unconsciousness wasn't fear. It was a question. What will I become to stop him? And far away, deep beneath the forest floor, the ancient power he had awakened stirred once more, not in anger, but in protection. Darkness wrapped itself around Jason like a heavy, wet cloth, thick and suffocating. He drifted somewhere between waking and sleeping, his body weightless, his thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. He didn't know how long he was unconscious. Time didn't feel real anymore. The only thing that remained steady was the sound of Serena's voice echoing faintly in the void. "Please, don't go." Then, a pulse of warmth surged through his chest. It spread outward like ripples in a pond, and slowly, the world came back into focus. Jason opened his eyes. He was lying on a stone slab, smooth and cold. Above him, glowing roots stretched across the ceiling like a web of veins. The chamber was deep underground, lit by faint green light from crystal bulbs that pulsed with life. The air was thick with energy, something ancient, something that hummed softly against his skin. Beside him, Serena sat with her back against the wall, her head resting on her knees. She looked exhausted. Her arm was wrapped in a soft blue cloth, stained with dried blood. Her eyes were closed, but the tension in her body never left. Jason tried to sit up. Pain rippled through his side, but it was dull now, fading. Serena's eyes snapped open. She scrambled toward him, relief rushing across her face. "You're awake," she whispered, voice shaking. Jason blinked, looking around. Where are we?" "Below the heart tree," she said. "The sanctuary. It's hidden from their scans. Only the Velari know the path." Jason touched his chest. His clothes were scorched, torn at the edges. He remembered the blast. Cashin's voice. The fire. The fall. "I should be dead," he murmured. "You would have been," Serena replied softly. "But the tree, it shielded you. Just before the strike hit, it responded to your pain." Jason let that sink in. The heart tree. Alive. Listening. Protecting him. But why? Serena seemed to read his thoughts. "You're connected to it now. Not like us. Not like the warlord. Something in your blood. Something balanced. The tree sees you as both light and dark. You're its last hope." Jason shook his head slowly. "I'm not ready for this. I don't even understand half of what's happening." "None of us do," she said with a tired smile. "But you're not alone anymore." Jason met her gaze. There was something behind her words, something deeper than duty or prophecy. He didn't say anything, but the silence between them said enough. The ground above them rumbled suddenly. Dust drifted down from the ceiling. The war had not ended. It had only paused. Serena stood. "The warlord has reached the base of the heart tree. He's trying to break its core. If he corrupts it, the forest dies. All of it." Jason stood too, wobbling slightly before finding his balance. He felt stronger than he had before, like the tree's energy still lingered in his blood, waiting. He looked down at his hands. Faint golden veins glowed beneath his skin, pulsing with life. The staff, now leaning against the wall, glimmered in the soft light, as though it remembered his touch. "What happened to the others?" he asked. "The villagers? The warriors?" Serena's expression darkened. "Some escaped. Many didn't. Cashin brought a new weapon, a kind of energy that poisons the land itself. It spreads, turns the trees black. The forest is dying." Jason walked to the staff and picked it up. The moment his fingers closed around it, a current ran through his spine, warm and grounding. The weapon responded like an old friend. "I need to face him," Jason said. Serena stepped closer. "You're not strong enough yet. Not alone." Jason looked at her, then at the pulsing crystals in the walls. "Then I need to stop being alone." The sanctuary had other chambers. Jason could feel them. Tunnels that pulsed with light, rooms that hadn't been touched in centuries. Guided by instinct, he followed the roots deeper into the heart tree. Serena came with him, silent but watchful. They entered a large circular chamber, its ceiling arched and layered in living vines. In the center stood a stone pedestal surrounded by floating shards of crystal. Jason approached slowly, drawn to it. "This is the core," Serena whispered, "the living heart of Velari knowledge. Our ancestors poured their memories into this place." As Jason stepped forward, the shards spun faster. Light flowed through them, weaving lines in the air like a spider's web. The moment he touched the pedestal, a rush of energy exploded through the chamber. His mind was filled with images, thousands of them. Cities of light, peaceful beings floating above oceans of mist, ancient rituals, battles against shadows, the rise of Cashin, his betrayal, his transformation, and finally, a vision of Jason himself, standing in flames, facing the warlord beneath a dying sky. He stumbled back, gasping for air. Serena caught him. "What did you see?" "Everything," he said. "I saw everything." The knowledge had changed him. He understood now why he had survived, why the tree had chosen him. Cashin had tried to bond with the forest long ago, but his heart had been filled with fear and greed. He sought power without purpose. The tree had rejected him, violently. Jason was different. He had given, not taken. He had shielded, not struck. And because of that, the forest had let him in. Jason looked at Serena, fire in his eyes. "We can't wait anymore. We strike now." She nodded. "Then we take the path of the roots, straight to the warlord." They moved swiftly, climbing through hidden tunnels that twisted and pulsed with living light. The deeper they went, the louder the sound of destruction became. Explosions cracked the soil. Smoke crept through the tunnels. They were running out of time. Finally, they reached the surface. Jason emerged into a nightmare. The heart tree stood tall but scarred. Its lower trunk burned and cracked. Roots had been severed and blackened patches spread like poison through the soil. Drones circled its canopy, firing beams of corruption into its bark. And there, at the center, stood Cashin. He was taller now, more metal than flesh. His body glowed with sick green veins. His face, what was left of it, bore no humanity, only hunger. Jason stepped forward. Cashin turned, smiling with those unnatural eyes. "Ah, the hero returns." Jason didn't speak. Cashin tilted his head. "You survived the blast. Impressive. Maybe I was wrong about you." "You've been wrong about everything," Jason said. "This world doesn't belong to you." Cashin chuckled. "Belong? Oh boy. This isn't about ownership. It's about evolution. The forest holds power no one understands, not even the Villari. I just want to unlock it." "You tried," Jason said, raising the staff. "And it rejected you." Cashin's smile vanished. Jason stepped closer. "You know what it showed me. You. Falling. Burning. Alone." Cashin snarled. "I gave this world purpose. I gave it progress. And it spat in my face." "You gave it pain," Jason said. "I'll give it peace." With a roar, Cashin launched himself forward, his arm transforming into a blade of pure energy. Jason dodged, spun, and struck back with the staff. Light clashed against darkness, power against corruption. Their battle shook the earth. Every strike from Cashin brought fire. Every block from Jason sparked light. Serena joined the fight, her remaining arrows glowing with forest energy, piercing drones out of the sky. But Cashin was strong, too strong. Jason began to falter. His arms ached. His legs trembled. The warlord was relentless. Then the staff began to glow brighter. Not from Jason's strength, but from the forest. The roots around them stirred. The ground beneath their feet pulsed. The tree responded to Jason's will. Cashin struck one final blow, an overhead slam meant to crush Jason. But Jason raised the staff, and from the earth, a wall of living bark erupted, catching the blade. Jason pushed forward, roaring. The staff lit up like a sun, and with a final strike, he drove it into Cashin's chest. Light exploded. Cashin screamed, not in pain, but in terror. His body cracked, splintered, dissolved. And then he was gone. Silence fell. The forest sighed. Jason collapsed to his knees. Serena ran to him, catching him before he fell. Her hands glowed faintly as she pressed them against his chest. "You did it," she whispered. Jason looked up at the heart tree. The scars remained, but it still stood, still alive. He had stopped the end. But deep inside, he knew something else had changed. Something was waiting, just beyond the stars. Smoke rose in slow, curling tendrils through the canopy, tracing black veins across the once pristine sky. Where fire had raged and metal had torn through ancient bark, the forest now stood quiet, breathing in ragged sighs. The battle was over. The earth had ceased trembling. The screams had faded, and in the stillness that followed, Jason Carter stood at the base of the heart tree, his legs heavy, his chest heaving, his mind strangely still. The staff, now dim and pulsing with a faint amber light, hung loosely in his hand. His clothes were torn, his skin streaked with blood and soot, but his spirit remained unbroken. Around him, the forest stirred slowly, as if testing whether peace had truly returned, or if this silence was only another trick of war. He turned his head to look at Serena, who stood a few paces away, her expression unreadable. Her violet eyes reflected not joy, not relief, but something deeper, awe, grief, and the weight of 100 generations finally catching up to her. Jason wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. Instead, they both turned their gaze upward to the heart tree, which loomed over them like a sleeping titan. Its trunk was still cracked, its lower roots still scorched, but its leaves glowed faintly, returning to their soft golden hue. The tree was healing, slowly but surely. Then came the rustle, gentle, purposeful. From the deeper woods, Villari survivors emerged. Children, elders, wounded warriors. Their eyes fell upon Jason, and they stopped in their tracks, silent, reverent. Some looked afraid, others wept openly. A young warrior stepped forward and dropped to one knee. Then another, and another. Within moments, they all knelt, hundreds of them, before the lone human who had risen in fire and stood between them and oblivion. Jason took a step back, uncomfortable. He wasn't a god. He hadn't done this alone. He looked at Serena for help, but she only stepped forward and raised her voice so all could hear. He did not come to conquer. He came to protect. There was no cheering, no loud celebration. Just the quiet sound of wind through the leaves as the Villari lowered their heads, not in worship, but in solemn respect. Jason finally spoke, his voice low and uncertain. "I'm not what you think I am." The elder, who had survived the battle with a broken arm and a singed robe, stepped forward with a tired smile. "You're more, because you chose to be." Jason looked away, unsure how to carry the weight of their gratitude. He hadn't come here to be a hero. He had only tried to survive, to help someone, to stop something terrible. But the tree had made him part of something larger. As the Villari began to tend to the wounded and bury the fallen, Serena led Jason through the ruins of what had once been her village. The crystal towers were shattered. The air hummed with leftover energy, the scars of war still fresh. "We'll rebuild," she said, more to herself than to him. Jason nodded. "I can help." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "You've done enough." He shook his head. "Not yet." She studied him, the corners of her lips twitching into something between a smile and a frown. "You still think this is your fight?" "I know it is," he said. They walked in silence until they reached a shallow spring, now tainted slightly with ash, but still flowing. Jason knelt to wash his face, watching the water ripple away the blood and dirt. When he looked up again, he saw something strange reflected in the water. His own eyes, but faintly glowing with gold light. He leaned closer. "What is happening to me?" Serena knelt beside him, watching the reflection too. "You were touched by the heart. You carry its memory now." "What does that mean?" "It means," she said softly, "you are no longer fully human. But you are not Villari either. You are something new." Jason looked at her, alarmed. "Is that why I'm still alive? Why I keep surviving things I shouldn't?" She nodded. The forest wants you to live. For now. He stood slowly. What happens when it doesn't? Serena didn't answer. Later that night, as the stars returned to the sky and the smoke finally cleared, a fire was built in the center of the ruined village. Not a funeral fire, though there had been many losses, but a beacon, a symbol. The Velari gathered around it, not to celebrate war, but to mark the end of their silence. For the first time in generations, they were no longer hiding. Jason sat at the edge of the circle, away from the others. His thoughts were a storm. The images the heart tree had shown him still echoed in his mind. Visions of distant worlds, ancient wars, even Earth. His home. He wondered if Earth even knew what had happened here. If anyone had received his distress signal. If someone was coming. And then he wondered if he even belonged there anymore. He was still thinking when the elder approached and handed him something wrapped in cloth. Jason unwrapped it slowly. It was a blade. Old, carved from bone and root. Its edge shimmered with light. This was meant for the guardian, the elder said. We kept it hidden for centuries. Waiting. Jason looked at the weapon, hesitant. I'm not sure I want this. The elder smiled gently. That is why you are worthy of it. Jason looked up. Is it over? The elder's smile faded. For now. But darkness is not bound to one world. And you carry something with you now. Something others will sense. Others who would take it. Jason felt the blade grow heavier in his hands. I didn't ask for any of this, he whispered. None of us did, the elder replied. But sometimes, the forest chooses. And we must answer. That night, Jason didn't sleep. He sat beneath the wounded tree and watched the stars wheel overhead. He thought of Earth, of the soldiers he'd served with, of the boy he used to be before space and war and prophecy tangled him into something new. And as he sat there, the ground beneath him gave a soft pulse. The tree was dreaming again. And in its dream, Jason saw the stars begin to fall. Something was coming. Not Cashin. Not hunters. Something worse. Jason gripped the blade tighter. The fire inside him had not gone out. It had only just begun to burn. The forest was quiet now, not the silence of fear or sorrow, but the rare, sacred stillness that came after survival. The kind of silence that held breath and memory, as if the trees themselves were reflecting. In the heart of this stillness, Jason stood beneath the great tree that had almost died to protect him. Its bark, once blackened and cracked from the warlord's assault, now shimmered faintly in the moonlight, its wounds slowly healing, leaf by glowing leaf. He had stayed by its side for days, listening to the whisper of leaves, the pulse of energy beneath the roots. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw visions, fragments of other lives, other worlds. He had stopped trying to understand them. The heart tree had left a mark on him far deeper than he could explain. He was not just part of this planet now. He was part of its memory. Serena watched him from a short distance, arms folded loosely across her chest. She could feel it too, the quiet power growing in him. The Velari didn't speak of it openly, but they saw it in the way the animals no longer fled from him, in how wounded trees bent toward him as if seeking comfort. He had become something between man and myth. Guardian, heir, bridge. But Jason didn't feel like a savior. He felt unfinished. On the 5th morning after the battle, a tremor shook the forest, not from below, but from above. A deep vibration hummed through the ground, stirring the still waters, rattling the canopy. Jason stood immediately, scanning the skies. He wasn't the only one. Velari scouts scrambled through the branches, eyes turned upward, weapons drawn with ancient instinct. Within minutes, Serena was beside him, her face unreadable. It's a ship, she said. Not his. Something else. Jason narrowed his eyes. Earth? No signal, she replied. But it's old. The design. Rusted edges. And it's broadcasting a language I don't recognize. Jason's breath caught. If it wasn't Cashin's, If it wasn't Earth, then who? They climbed to the highest ridge above the canopy, where the trees parted in reverence. From there, they saw it, a massive battered starship descending in slow spirals, its hull covered in strange glyphs and burn marks. The engines sputtered, not with military precision, but with aged fatigue. It looked like it had traveled for years, maybe decades. Jason stared, pulse quickening. Something about the ship's shape stirred something in him, a memory he couldn't place. Then he saw it, the emblem on the underbelly. A red crescent curled around a shattered planet. His breath froze. It was not Earth. It was the Collectors. He'd heard the name once, in a classified Earth military report buried under layers of red tape. They were scavengers of extinct worlds, looters of dead planets, searching for ancient technology to harvest, sell, or weaponize. They didn't conquer with armies. They arrived after the war ended, feeding on the ruins. Jason felt the staff on his back vibrate faintly, as if warning him. "They're here for the heart," he said. "They picked up the energy surge from the battle. They think this world is dead, and they've come to take what's left." Serena's expression darkened. "Then they'll be disappointed." Jason stepped forward, voice low, "Or they'll make sure it does die." Within hours, the collector ship landed in a valley west of the forest, crushing old stone temples and sacred roots beneath its massive weight. Doors opened with a hiss, and figures emerged, tall, masked, draped in metallic armor pieced together from a dozen fallen species. Their weapons were sleek, quiet, deadly. They didn't speak. They scanned, cataloged, marked. Jason watched from the trees, surrounded by a small group of Velari scouts. He counted 12. No, 15. All armed, all methodical. These weren't warriors. They were harvesters, which made them more dangerous. Serena crouched beside him. They're heading toward the ruins, toward the sanctuary. Jason exhaled slowly. "Then we need to move." "But we've lost too much," she whispered. "We have no strength left for another battle." Jason's jaw tightened. "Then I'll face them alone." She grabbed his arm firm. "No, not again." But Jason's eyes weren't full of fire anymore. They held something else now, calm, steady light. "I'm not sacrificing myself. Not this time. I'm going to offer them a choice." He stepped out from the trees before anyone could stop him. The staff glowed faintly on his back. The Velari gasped in hushed tones, but none called him back. Serena stayed frozen, her fingers trembling. Jason approached the collectors slowly, hands raised. The nearest one turned, its eye scanning him behind a blank, mirrored visor. "Species, human," a robotic voice said. "You are not authorized to remain in this salvage zone." Jason didn't stop walking. "This isn't a salvage zone." The voice repeated, louder. "You are in violation of interstellar claim protocol. Stand down or be neutralized." Jason came to a stop 10 feet away. "This planet is alive. You'll touch nothing." The other collectors turned. One raised a weapon. Jason didn't flinch. "I've bonded with the heart," he said, voice steady. "If you harm it, you won't just lose this world. You'll lose every future you were hoping to sell." The weapon remained raised. Jason reached behind him slowly, drawing the staff. The moment it left its harness, the ground trembled. Roots slithered out from beneath the soil, coiling, watching. "You see that?" Jason said softly. "This planet knows me." The staff lit up in gold. The wind howled. Somewhere deep within the earth, the heart tree pulsed, and every leaf in the forest turned toward the valley. The collectors hesitated. Jason took one more step. "You came for scraps," he said. "But this world is not broken. It's healing. And if you try to take from it, I'll bury your ship in the dirt so deep your ancestors will forget where it fell." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the lead collector lowered his weapon. The others followed. The voice returned, neutral, unreadable. "Claim rescinded. planet marked as protected. The group turned and marched back to the ship. Jason stood perfectly still as the engines roared back to life, lifting the vessel with a shudder of steam and light. The great ship vanished into the sky like a fading shadow. Only when the silence returned did he finally exhale. He turned and found Serena standing behind him. "You did it again," she whispered. Jason gave a tired smile. "No, this time. I just talked." She stepped closer, placing her hand over his heart. "It's still glowing," she said. He looked down. The golden light pulsed faintly beneath his skin. "I think it always will," he replied. Later that night, when the forest was lit with lanterns instead of fire, Jason stood one last time beneath the heart tree. Serena joined him, and beside them stood the elders, the warriors, and the children who had survived. The elder held out a crystal no larger than a coin. "This contains the memory of this place, the song of our people. If you ever leave, carry us with you." Jason took it, gently. Serena looked at him. "Will you stay?" He looked up at the stars, where Earth waited. "I don't know," he said. "Part of me belongs here, but I think I need to go back, if only to remind them what humanity can be." Serena smiled softly. "And if you come back?" He looked at her, eyes filled with 1,000 unspoken things. "Then I'll know where home really is." The forest didn't protest. It simply waited. As Jason stepped toward the ancient gate, a soft breeze whispered through the leaves, like a farewell, like a promise. He didn't turn back, but he carried the forest with him. And far across the galaxy, in places where darkness still ruled, something stirred. Because somewhere out there, they had heard of him. The human who shielded a stranger and changed a world.